I'm not ashamed to own my Lord, nor to defend his cause. Maintain the honors of his word, the glory of his cross.
We're beginning in the book of Nahum. And
The clicker is up there.
use the keyboard.
The clicker's up there. It's behind you. It's behind you.
Oh, right there.
It's behind your monitor.
Okay. And Nahum now, if you, the bottom, the minor prophets, Nahum now is the 34th book. We've been through 34 books of the Old Testament, and now we're in the 7th book of the minor prophets. And the minor prophets, remember, being from Hosea through to Malachi. And the book is Nahum's message to Judah. But it concerns the city of Nineveh, which is at this point in history, she's at her height in power. And the city seems to be impregnable. It's a powerful, the Assyrian nation is powerful, but the city of Nineveh is a powerful city. It's a fortress. And it is to Nineveh he prophesies. And where have we heard of Nineveh before? Where? Jonah. Right, Jonah. 100 years prior to Nahum now, remember Jonah had preached to this city their need to repent. And can you remember what happened? How did Nineveh?
They repented.
Right, they repented. But now, though, we see that it's time for them to be punished because their repentance didn't last. They backslid into sin. And now Nahum is saying that the mighty city was to fall because of her cruel oppression of the people of God. And we'll talk about that a little later on. As for the origin of Nahum, we look at the title, as usual. And first of all, what is the meaning of Nahum's name? What does his name mean? Remember, all the Old Testament prophets, their names meant similar to the message of the book. And what does Nahum mean? What did his name mean? Be under your title section.
Comfort or consolation.
Right. That was what Nahum's name meant. Comfort or consolation. And Dave asked us then, how is the meaning of the prophet's name connected to the content of his message? And I might point out that Nahum the prophet in his book makes no mention of the internal conditions in Judah or Jerusalem. And he leaves that to his contemporaries. Remember, he prophesied at the time of, same time roughly as Jeremiah and Habakkuk, or Habakkuk, whichever way you want to pronounce it, and Zephaniah. But in the New American Standard Bible, it points out that his book is an oracle of Nineveh. Anybody know what that word means, oracle? It's used in the Old Testament, which I was kind of interested in discovering, but oracle in 1 Kings chapter 6 and verse 5 is used for the inner sanctuary of the temple, that room was called an oracle. But in the New Testament, the Greek word refers to the inspired Old Testament scriptures in whole or in part. Look at Acts 7 and verse 38. Acts 7 and verse 38. I'll get you, Naomi, to get that, and Tammy, I'll give you Hebrews 5 and 12.
This is the one who was in the congregation in the wilderness with the angel who spoke to him at Mount Sinai with our fathers. He received living oracles to give to us.
And Tammy?
For though by this time you ought to be teachers, you have need again for someone to teach you the elementary principles of the oracles of God, and you have come to need milk and not solid food.
Okay. So the oracle there is used as the inspired Old Testament scriptures. But there's something interesting in Nahum 1 and verse 1 that goes along with Dave's question here. But the King James Version and also the New King James Version use the word burden of Nineveh. Okay? I been using the American Standard quite a bit, and it has oracle, but King James has burden of Nineveh. And this word, well, maybe before I speak, what might that bring to your mind? It's speaking of a burden of Nineveh. So first of all, we know it's inspired, right? And Nahum has a vision, right? The book of the vision of Nahum. And how do you think burden ties in with that? Any thought? If not, I've had time to think about it. It's this word is never placed in a title of any of our prophets, except when the vision is heavy and full of burden and toil. Okay, Nahum's prophecy is very stern and awful. That's how the words that Albert Barnes uses in his commentary. In other words, this oracle that's being presented to Nineveh is described as a burden. It's a heavy oracle. Toiling is the thought behind it. In other words, this is something that Nineveh is, first of all, not going to want to hear. And then it is something that is going to be burdensome to them. And with that thought, then, knowing that this is aimed at Nineveh, Nahum's main name being meaning comfort, how do we see that connected to his message? Because remember, he's bringing his message twofold. First of all, who is it coming to? Who's it being told to? We know it's being aimed at Nineveh, but who's hearing this message? Judah, right. So what Dave wants us to see is, we see the comfort here that is brought to Judah through the downfall of Nineveh. Judah is being told, Nahum is telling Judah that Nineveh is going to be brought down. And look at verse, Colin Gord, I'll give you chapter 1, and Colin, you read verse 12, and Gord, you read 13 and 15. So Colin, verse 12.
Thus says the Lord, though they are at full strength, and likewise many, even so they will be cut off and pass away. Though I have afflicted you, I will afflict you no longer.
And now I will break his yoke from off you, and will burst your bones apart. Behold, upon the mountains, the feet of him who brings good news, who establishes peace. Keep your feasts, O Judah, fulfill your vows, and never again shall the wholeness or worthless pass through you. He is utterly cut off.
Okay, we're going to look at these verses later in more depth, but we see there in verses 12 and 13, God is telling Judah, explaining to them what Nineveh is like. She's full of strength. But they are going to be cut off and pass away. And then he lets Judah know, though I've afflicted you with them, I will afflict you no longer. And that is meaning with Assyria. And then in verse 15, that Gord read, we see the end of that outcome, where they will be free, and there will be one who will bring good news of that disaster to Nineveh. So we see then the idea of Nahum's name being meaning comfort. Judah is going to find comfort through these verses, through what Nahum has told them. Don't worry, even though this nation, and we'll speak about them a little later on, though they're mighty, they're going to be brought down. And so that would bring comfort to Judah. Also, they're going to have to be patient, of course, but those that put their trust in God would have seen that. Comments? So we'll move on to the author. And I'm not sure, I don't think there's a question for that, no. But we're told in the opening verse of the book that Nahum is from Elkish, and that town has never really been identified. There are areas that have been put forward to of where that town might be, and I've got this map for us just to kind of give us an idea. But some say that the town of Elkasy, because he was well, Elkasy is I think just here on this side of Galilee. So some say that that is Elkish. The town of Capernaum, because that name, Capernaum, meant village of Nahum. So we're not sure. And Capernaum, of course, you know, was on the west side of the Sea of Galilee. And then there was a village of Cecil, maybe, Cecil, and it was located midway between Jerusalem and Gaza. So it was down in this area. And then also, historians say that the city of Elkish near Mosul in Assyria, just north of Nineveh, they say that that might have been Nahum's village. But that city that's north of Nineveh was not really around till I think later, maybe even the 18th century. So we really don't know where Nahum's hometown was, but the book seems to suggest that Nahum is a citizen of Judah, based on the fact that his concern lied with them. but really we know a little more of Nahum. This is his book, his vision God gave him, and that's all we know of it. But as for the date, of course we walked through our time periods again. Remember, roughly 1446 BC was when Moses received the Ten Commandments on Mount Sinai. And then in 931 BC, the kingdom was divided. And here we hear of Assyria. Israel is conquered by Assyria in 722 BC. And remember, Judah was way off into the future. 586 BC, Judah is conquered by Babylon. And we're going to look at why we put Nahum's message in around 650, 640 BC, because there's a lack of information for an exact date for Nahum's prophecies. Really, with all our prophets, there are discrepancies with the time periods, and we know that is just the fault of historians. But there are some events, though, that are mentioned that help us in narrowing down the general time frame. And that comes in this question. Question 2, how do the events discussed in the following passages provide a definite time frame during which the prophecy of Nahum must have been delivered? There's some things that we'll read here that will help us narrow it down. And if we go to Nahum chapter 3, Nahum chapter 3, and starting at verse 8, we'll read, I'm scanning here if there's some tough names. I think we missed them in this one. I mean, we come across the king's names, stumble through them, and do the best we can. But Nahum 3, verses 8 to 11, and we'll read a verse each. I guess, Lisa, are we back at you now? Okay, you read verse 8, and then we'll go to Annette.
Are you better than Ammon, that was situated by the river, that had the waters around it, whose rampart was the sea, whose wall was the sea?
From here and Egypt was her strength, and it was boundless. With the Rubim were your helpers.
Yet she was carried away. She went into captivity. Her young children also were dashed to pieces as the big head of Pharaoh's people. They cast blood for her all over men, and all her great men were bound in chains.
You took them and you were
Okay. In this passage, and we'll look into this a little more later on, but Nahum is describing here the conquest of, I believe it's pronounced Thebes, which is Ammon. That is the town. And that conquest took place by, there was a king I was going to get Tammy to help me pronounce, but
It's Ashur-Benipal.
what is it?
Ashur-Benipal.
Ashur-Benipal.
It's thieves.
Ashur-Benipal? Okay, that sounds pretty good. The second, and that conquest had already taken place in 663 BC. And so remember, this is why that conquest then would have taken place back in here somewhere, right? So it's already happened, and Nahum is presenting this to Judah. So the book couldn't have been written before that date, because he's speaking of it as a past event. And Nineveh's attitude maybe it was my next reading. I had that. Yeah. Oh no, here we are. That's the wrong page. Nineveh, remember, to most people and other nations, seemed impregnable. It was a powerful city, and knowing that, it must have made Nahum's prophecy really seem utterly ridiculous to a lot of people. Who or what could ever bring down a city this strong? She was armed, Assyria was armed to the teeth, if you will, in our ways of describing. No one around at that time was any match for her armies. You know, people would have thought Nahum's dreaming. This could never happen. But if it could not happen to Nineveh, Nahum argues, if it can't happen to Nineveh, then someone needs to explain to me how it happened to Thesbis, to Noaman. That town also was a seemingly impregnable city. That was the capital city of Upper Egypt at that time. And she was on the Nile. There was water on both sides. There was all kinds of protection. But so what Nahum is trying to say is that if that was captured, then who are you? You know, a city as great as you are at this moment was also captured. And so that is his argument to the people. You know, don't think too highly. As for Judah, you know, don't worry, God is in control. And then as for Nineveh, why do you think you can escape when this other city was taken down? And then in Nahum 2, verses 8 to 10. Nahum 2, verses 8 to 10, and we'll, Annie, you can read verse 8, and then we'll come up to Tim and Sandy.
His spoil of silver, his spoil of gold. There is no end of treasure or wealth of every desirable kind.
Okay, again, we'll come back and look at the pictures that Nahum is painting here in our minds. But for now, we just see here that Nahum's speaking of Nineveh's destruction, but it didn't take place till 613 BC. So it was down in here somewhere. But he is, of course, prophesying about that. And so it's a future event. So he spoke of the event in Egypt that took place before this time, and he's speaking of one that's going to take place as a future event. And with Assyria at her peak at this time, then we think these dates seem to be a good estimate, is what we would say, a good estimate. And Nahum 2 and verse 6, I found this interesting. Nahum 2 and verse 6 says here, Nahum says, The gates of the rivers are opened, and the palace is dissolved. And look back at chapter 1 and verse 8. Chapter 1 and verse 8. But with an overflowing flood, he, that's God, will make a complete end of its sight, and it will pursue his enemies into darkness. Those two verses are speaking of the destruction of Nineveh. And it's interesting that they seem to corroborate with secular history, in that the city walls were breached, historians say, by an unusual heavy downpour at that time, which caused the flooding of the Euphrates and the Kahorsa rivers. Those rivers, Nineveh was right at those rivers. And this flooding undermined the northeast section of the city wall, which allowed for easy access into the city. And there certainly is, in both those verses, a strong association between the flooding and the capture of that city. Because remember, that city was impregnable. There's no way people were getting in. But we see these verses seem to speak of a flooding and the capture of the city. And so both in the Bible and in external sources seem to go together, don't they? And that must be why Nahum says that the gates of the rivers are open and the palace is dissolved. He's explaining how that took place. And then after the invading armies, of course, gained access to the city through the damaged walls, then what we continue to read is that terror spread as the enormous wealth of Nineveh, which we'll look into later. Nineveh had pilfered from the nations of the Near East enormously, and that was all taken as booty, if you would say, when they were attacked. And this all happened because it was decreed in chapter 2. We'll just read this one verse for now. Chapter 2 and verse 7, it is fixed. Okay, Nahum's speaking here for God. It is fixed. She is stripped, she is carried away, and her handmaids are moaning like the sound of doves beating on their breasts. It was now Nineveh's turn to be destroyed, and the time had arrived, Nahum says. And so I just thought that was kind of interesting, the secular history. Again, we've read it in the Bible. And so we move on then to the purpose of Nahum, and in the historical section. And we're asked, why would Nahum's message concerning the destruction of Nineveh serve as a comfort to Judah? If you think back, Micah wished for this in his day, didn't he? That was the reason, remember, he escaped. He left on that ship. He wanted the destruction. But that wasn't God's plan at that time, was it? But now here in Nahum, 100 years later, Nahum is rejoicing over the fall of Nineveh. Nahum's cries might have really been compared to, remember Deborah's song back in Judges chapter 5? But to understand Nahum's attitude, we need, I thought, to consider the Assyrians and who they were. Whenever you read of any records of this people, we are immediately startled by their savage cruelty. And they had such a deep-seated desire to dominate as much territory as possible. And already way back on our timeline, back to 1100 BC, the Assyrian king Tiglath-Pileser the first, he described on his victory monuments, he made monuments, how he had conquered 83 kings and littered the mountains with their corpses, with those that were in the armies with them kings. And two centuries later, Ashur-Surpal, is that pretty close? The second, he vaulted that. He was even more proud. He vaulted those deeds by flaying captive kings alive, wallpapering his pillars with their skins. That's how gross he was. He hung up captives alive. All this stuff is marked on their stone pillars that they have discovered. He impaled captives. The list goes on. It's too appalling to even mention what these kings were like, what the Syrians were like. The atrocities and brutalities of the Assyrians became legendary in the Near East at that time. There was no one like them. It was just unbelievable. And they also, I found interesting, displayed to me a true meaning of being proud. They would, after their battles won, they would have parades back in Nineveh, back in their cities. And in those parades, they would publicly mock the true God of heaven and earth. And they would publicly then give credit to their own idol gods. Okay? And that reminded me of Sodom and Gomorrah. Remember how proud they were? And I discovered that in the Hebrew and in the descriptive form, proud was described as standing toe-to-toe with God and mocking him to his face. If we could do that. That's how these Assyrians were. That's how Sodom and Gomorrah, that's how proud they were. That we have that picture of them standing nose to nose with God. And as we'll see with Nineveh, that was a big mistake. They had no idea who they were dealing with. But the first contact Israel had with the Assyrians was during the reign of the Assyrian king Shalmaneser. Remember him, the third? That was way back in 858 to 824 BC. So the Assyrians weren't new to Israel. In 854 BC, remember King Ahab of Israel, and remember King Ben-Hadad of Syria. Those were two different nations, two different people. Remember, they gathered 9 other princes, and they tried to go up against Shalmaneser at that time. That was unsuccessful. But Shalmaneser boasted that he slew over 20,000 men in his victory. And 12 years later, King Jehu of Israel and King Hazael of Syria, remember, they again tried to take down Assyria. They were defeated. But now they're paying tribute to Assyria. And the Assyrians, in secular history and through our study of the Bible, they dominated the East, the Far East, or the Near East, for over a century. They were the power. And their power was so cruel. They were despicable in their need and desire for not only taking cities, but in doing in all the people. And so, if we put ourselves in Judah's shoes, knowing all this, see now Nahum, the idea of comfort is a little easier to understand, because if Nahum is telling me that, and I have seen the power of Assyria, I have two choices. Either I put my trust in God, that He's in control, or, like we saw last week, we devise our own ways. And so we'll study that a little more next week.
I'm not ashamed.